For the last 30 to 40 years in this country, there's been an income and wealth redistribution. Anybody who studies that, left-winger, right-winger, except for a few on the right, you can take a look at the Gini coefficient, you can take a look at all his status from the IRS and all the rest. We have moved wealth from the bottom and the middle in this country to the top. That's why even our candidates talk about the middle class is dying, the middle class is going. Yeah, that's right. The middle has fallen out, number one. Number two, you subjected them to a pandemic, which really shook them up, an inflation, which shook them up, still shakes them up, and a serious diminution in your position in the world. You have, over the last 30 to 40 years, you lost the war in Vietnam, you lost the war in Afghanistan, you lost the war in Iraq, and you are losing the war in Ukraine. Too many things are happening. And the working class is hit in too many ways. It's upset, it's angry, it doesn't see a way out. That's a description of the German working class. That's why it went with Hitler. Enough, not all of it by a long shot, but enough of it to give him the chance to get rid of all of his enemies and reshape Germany. That ought to strike a chord. This morning's headline, the headline when I opened my news, was that President Trump has appointed Vice President Vance to remove from the Smithsonian Institute the anti-American improper ideology. You know what the first thing comes to my mind? In the 1950s here in America, we had something called the Un-American Activities Committee in the House of Representatives that hounded people out of their jobs and their positions because they held views that a collection of congressmen, many from the South, held to be un-American. Now, we've come to regret that, but that's what they did. By the way, among the people who left the United States because they were hounded by this committee for their ideas were Bertolt Brecht, Charlie Chaplin. I could go on. I thought to understand what an aberrant, horrible period this was. We understood nothing. We're just doing it again. Will the outcome be the same? I don't know. Maybe they'll win this time. Maybe we won't have what happened in the 50s. We'll have what happened in Germany in the 30s. But the story in Germany of a working class that was shocked. The American working class was told that America was the king of the hill, which coming out of World War II, we were, and that this was just American exceptionalism, the uniqueness. God loves us, whatever the form in which you celebrated it. But nobody here was prepared that it would come to an end, that for the first time in a century, we actually have an economic competitor called China. We never had it. Russia, I think I told you this before, Russia was not an economic competitor. It was way too poor, way too small. Even today, the American GDP is $29 trillion. Russian GDP, $3 trillion. This is David and Goliath. They have military, they have nuclear weapons, but it's still David with a slingshot. China's 18 or 19 trillion. That's a serious competitor. The two together, now you talk, and they understand it. And so do the folks here, but not the American people. They must be kept innocent of all of this, except when they leak their materials to the Atlantic magazine. China is a recognition, as we talked a little bit before, that capitalism needs to go through all the phases it can to survive. It adjusted the private quality of its beginnings by allowing the state to take a bigger and bigger role. It didn't do it in a straight line. The great crash of 1929 brought the government in massively to save capitalism. But in the aftermath of World War II, they pushed the government back out. That's what you and I have lived our lives in a period when they pushed the government out. In a way, Mr. Trump is the end of that period. But here's the crucial thing for China. We've had the government minimal, early capitalism. We've had the government brought in, Keynes, the Depression, and then this thing called Scandinavian socialism, which seemed to mean a regulatory government, a taxing government, lots of social services produced by the government, but basically private capitalism for the bulk of the goods and services in society. Then we had the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union called itself socialist, like the Scandinavians do, but they meant something very different. They meant the government takes over and runs the enterprise. And they said that was socialism. but I would argue that it isn't. It wasn't socialism. But they never changed the employer-employee structure of enterprises. Small group of people, the owner, the director, the board of directors, whatever you want to call it, overseeing and ordering about a mass of workers who are employees. They have very little power. They have all the power. These people fire those, not the other way around. These people direct those, not the other way around. These people produce a surplus that they get, not the other way around. In other words, this is a highly structured arrangement. For me, that's capitalism. And that was there when capitalism was small and had a few workers, and it's there with a major corporation today. It's there whether the private people do it or whether the government does it. So for me, we're still working out all the ways you can have capitalism if you understand it as the employer-employee relationship in production. Then China is simply the latest experiment in yet another form. It's not private capitalism, where you might take the example Britain and the United States. It's not the Soviet Union, no private capitalism, all government does everything. The in-between, Scandinavian, with a little government and mostly private. And now the Chinese, 50-50, with a super powerful state and communist party on top. That's a wrinkle. But that wrinkle has been more productive in a shorter amount of time than any of the others. Just like the absolute monarchies were the most effective, spectacular achievements of feudalism. I think that the reason China is ahead is it figured out that form of capitalism, which could get it out of poverty, which was its number one goal. 100 years of humiliation of China. Was it because it was poor, backward technologically, underdeveloped, like the whole global south, like all of Africa, like most of Asia, like most of Latin America? The name of the game for them was above all else, not the struggle of capitalism and socialism. The leaders were worried about that. For the mass of people, how to get out of my poverty, all that meant, and begin to live life. The Chinese Communist Party understood that, in part because of their differences with the Soviet Union stuff that we talked about. And they understood that's the way we're going to try to do it. With all the risks, all the possibilities of failure, we're going to do a hybrid of 50. We're going to let the private go under our control. Meanwhile, keep our control by having half the economy right under. That's how we're going to do it. And at this moment, the year 2025, there is no contest anymore. Europe had 500 years to get ready to compete with the United States. All hot technology in the world today comes from the United States or China. Europe, nothing. There's no comparable Apple or Microsoft or BYD. BYD, the electric Chinese, they're on the roads of Europe because they don't have a 100% tariff. We do. Mr. Trump put it up to 27.5%, and Mr. Biden raised it to 100%. So if you want to buy a BYD electric car, best in the world, cheapest in the world, $30,000, get a car. That's what it'll cost. They'll ship you a car from China. They ship all over the world. I mean, all of that's taken care of. They're a very, very big and powerful company. There's an American who has a big piece of it, owns a big piece of BYD. His name is Warren Buffett, not held back by stupid leftover Cold War nonsense. BYD can't bring a car here because the $30,000 car, which I would buy tomorrow, if I have to give 100% tax to Uncle Sam, another 30. So for me, the car costs 60 grand, not 30. And that's why I don't buy any, because I can buy a $40,000 or $50,000 electric car from GM or Ford or Tesla or somebody else. It's not as good, but there's no tariff. These situations mean that Mr. Musk and the United States are more and more looked at as a problem to contain, a little bit like Soviet communism looked to Americans. And the Chinese, in my judgment, are on the cusp, as we are in the United States, although for completely different reasons, given our very different situations. We're on the cusp of discovering what European feudalism discovered, that the highest achievement, capitalism in China as this hybrid, is also the last achievement. The Louis in France, who built Versailles, Why? We're the same family of Louis who ended up on the guillotine with their heads chopped off. I'm, of course, not suggesting anything remotely like that could or would ever happen here. Now comes the question, what do we need to do better than what the Chinese have done? How will people define the problems that the Chinese have and will have? Even the Chinese are very wise about that. They understand their system has problems, different from what they used to have. Thank God, they're much better off than they used to be, but they have all kinds of economic and other problems. Here's my prediction. These problems will, sooner or later, and I hope it's sooner, be addressed by daring to relearn Marx's lesson. Take a look at how you organize production. The notion that you have to have a few people at the top who run the show and a mass of people underneath who do the work is your problem. You've got to get rid of that. It's a little bit like understanding that for the centuries that there was slavery, there were all kinds of people who understood those slave systems had a problem. And there were all kinds of people who understood, let's solve the problem this way. Give the slave a better diet. Give the slave some more clothing. Put the slave in a decent house. Stop eating the slave. And then there were people who said, no, you ain't going to solve your problem that way. You know what your problem is? The master-slave relationship. That's got to go. It's that relationship that has to go. That was Marx's point. Back in the 19th century, 150 years ago, he tried to get that across. Marx made mistakes. Marx is no saint, none of that. But he was very smart. And he set himself the problem, how do you do better than capitalism? And he spent a lifetime trying to figure it out. And he ended up with this conclusion. The problem of capitalism is itself. It's not get the workers a bigger wage. To stop. It's like getting the slave a better diet. Of course, we are in favor of a better diet for the slave with decent people. That's not the problem. The problem is slavery. The problem is capitalism. You have a tiny group of people who make all the decisions. Guess what? They're going to take the money and be the wealthy people, the top 10%. And every few years, we'll have a war on the poverty, which we seem unable to overcome. Look at the taboo in our culture right up to this minute. You can look at almost anything. Not that economic system. We will criticize our education system. We will criticize our transportation system. We even criticize institutions like marriage, like heterosexuality, but criticize the employer-employee doesn't occur to anyone. Well, 20 years ago, it didn't occur to anyone to question sexism or in many parts of the country, racism. There comes a time when in history it becomes possible to say, hey, this is outrageous. We won't tolerate this. That's going to come for capitalism. And my guess is whether it comes in the dying capitalism of the West or the rising capitalism of the East. My guess it's going to happen in both. And wherever it happens first, it'll be infectious on the other. Because the idea will be the problems we face now are finally those which will allow us to ask the question, might the solution to these problems be changing the organization of the workplace from a hierarchical top down to, dare I say, a democratic arrangement in which all the people at the workplace get together, talk it out, and then have a vote. One person, after we've looked at all the technical and other aspects, after we've asked the opinions of those who have the technical information we need to make an informed decision. I remind people, all the key decisions in major corporations are made by a board of directors, most of whom have no technical expertise whatsoever. They bring in the specialists who explain to them, as is needed to make the decision, what the technical ramification. When I explain how a democratic workplace is to be there, the sweeper can make a decision like the heart surgeon in a hospital. Sure he can. Those decisions that are technically complicated, the heart surgeons have to explain what they know. And the sweeper tells them about keeping the hallways clean. And then, when everybody's had a chance to explain, then you make a decision. That's all any board of directors ever did. That's what the workers democratically will do. And don't tell me it's not workable, because the same argument was used. How can uninformed voters make a decision? We need a king. We cut the king's head off. And the decisions are not arguably any worse, and in many ways better. So let's do that. Let's finally bring democracy to the workplace. It's long overdue. That's the next stage. That's what the revolution is about. Whether we'll see it this year, next year, who knows? Nobody nobody should say of folks like us that we only have a criticism. No, we do have a criticism. Nowadays, it's less and less necessary to justify having a criticism since everybody is feeling the need that there be some criticism because of what's going on. But we are often charged with not having an alternative. Yes, we do, and a good one, and one that comes right out of the problems today. I don't think we solve the poverty problem without the kind of change I've talked about. And my proof, look at it. We're surrounded by poverty. We've had wars on poverty repeatedly, every 20 years. This problem doesn't go away. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx writes that the capitalist system has to be understood as being as successful in reproducing poverty as it is in reproducing wealth. And boy, is that a Hegelian moment. These are all signs. You'd have to be really blind or desperate not to see all that's going on. This is a generation of Americans who don't believe that their children are going to have a higher standard of living than they do. More and more of the money you and I pay in taxes in the United States is not going to give us a useful service. It's going to pay off whoever lent money to the government. The United States is in a declining position in the world economy. You could pretend it wasn't there, you could deny it, but it's getting harder and harder as these tariffs and sanctions all show. When I was growing up in the United States, that was assumed to be somehow the magic benefit of being an American. Each generation would live better. You will live better than your parents. They live better than your grandparents, etc., etc., etc. It was just built into what came to be called American exceptionalism. It was nothing exceptional at all. It was that profits were better here for all kinds of reasons, and capital came here. And when profits became better somewhere else, capital left. We are hysterical as a nation with the problems we can't solve and the magical scapegoats with which our leaders propose to distract us. Well, the United States at this point is stuck on its own history. It can't adjust. It has developed a society which told itself and its people that the profit motive is the royal road to prosperity and success. Let companies pursue the profit over the last 30 years, companies did that. They pursued the profit and they went to China or they went to India or they went to Brazil, which they're still doing. And so Americans were stuck. What were they going to say? We don't believe in the profit motive. The results of the profit are not good for us. They would have to rethink the entire pro-capitalist ideology that private pursuit of profit leads to the best outcome for everybody. Look, that's what's taught in the universities where I've been a professor all my life. That's what was taught to me. And I went to all the elite universities here. That was the ideology. And the problem is that misunderstands that capitalism is, in fact, a profit-driven system, and it will therefore go where the profits dictate. If you're the place to which profit dictates investment, you're having a good time. You're having the second half of the 20th century in the United States. But if you're living in a country which isn't the profit attractor, because that's somewhere else, China, India, then you're going to be on the bad side of the profit motive. That's what's forcing itself into the consciousness of the United States. They're now seeing that free trade and profit-driven is what lost the jobs. You referred to it earlier correctly about the disappearing middle class. They're beginning to understand. Let's be economic historians together just for a moment. Here I live in the United States, the history of our country. We once had capitalism dynamic and growing in the area called New England. Maine, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and so on. Then eventually it moved into what we call the mid-Atlantic states, New York, Pennsylvania, and so on. Then it moved to the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Then it moved to the South and the far West, California, and so on. And it left behind empty factories, depressed economic units. In recent decades, it's left the United States altogether. General Motors produces more cars in China than it does in the United States. Ditto for Ford, and so on. Well, guess what, friends? Capitalism, looking for profits, goes where the profits are the highest. And over the last 30 years, what China has done, no great secret, it has said to the world's capitalists, come here. We want you. We welcome you. We offer you an educated, disciplined labor force, much cheaper than what you pay your workers in Western Europe or North America or Japan. And because we are growing, we offer you the fastest growing market. And because we have a huge population, it's the world's biggest and fastest growing market. Well, I've been a professor at business schools, and I can assure you, we teach the students who are the future business leaders that if you want your business to succeed, you go where the wages are low and the market is growing. That's what you do. And so capitalists have left the United States, Western Europe, and Japan and moved into China, India, Brazil. If you don't like that, if it depresses you about what that means, that all of America is now experiencing the decline that New England and Mid-Atlantic experienced half a century ago, then the problem for you is capitalism, not this or that detail. It's a system that goes to where the profits are, and the profits are not here unless you create them artificially. Tariffs give you artificial profit opportunities by being able to jack up the prices. But that's called an inflation, has other very negative consequences. The poor capitalists are stuck. What they do to solve a problem makes another problem worse. That's another sign of decline. Secretary of the Treasury Yellen went to China and invented an entirely new economics. Excess capacity, she said. The Chinese produce huge factories. Of course they do. That's how they achieve their efficiency. It's called economies of scale. It's something we teach economics students in the first year. If you produce a lot of something, you can bring down the cost per unit of what you produce. So you always build in excess capacity. Competitive enterprises do it all the time. It's part of American economic history. She's just counting, Ms. Yellen is, on people not understanding these basics, and so finding this to be some sort of argument as if the Chinese have cheated. No, they didn't. They outdid you. Competition always has winners and losers. And I know that here in America, I'm born and raised here, we cannot imagine the United States losing ever anything. But we do. We lost the war in Vietnam. We lost the war in Afghanistan. But Americans need to believe that we're always winning. The tariffs are a sign that American dominance, which we got used to after World War II, from the second half of the 20th century, was the dominance of the United States. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, it left the United States, political scientists like to call a unipolar moment. But that's over now. The United States isn't what it was, and the Chinese and their allies have become a powerful new competitor. And the United States is having a hard time adjusting, which I can understand. And the politicians don't know what to do. Their ideology was free market. That didn't work out. They're now switching to economic nationalism, protecting everywhere, sanctioning, funding this company, funding that company. Billions have been given, for example, to Elon Musk. The production of electric vehicles in this country by Tesla is a government-funded project. Americans don't want to face that. But if they hadn't done that, then he would have done everything elsewhere, or he wouldn't have done it at all. The government is crucial, not just when we collapse, like in 2008 and 9, and the government had to come in and bail out the banks, or in 2020-21, when the government had to save us from the COVID pandemic. The government is continuously now being brought in because this capitalism cannot compete. The United States is at an earlier stage. The sanctions you see, the tariffs you see, that's a switch to protectionism by a society that has no confidence in its own companies' ability to compete. We used to. That's when the U.S. was the champion of free trade around the world. That's because we could win in those situations. We were the most technologically dynamic. We were the fastest growing, but we're not anymore. And we haven't been for a generation now. And it's beginning to impact us day by day. And nobody should be fooled by leaders who continue to sanction and to tariff as if we were free to do that without consequences. Here's the most important bottom line for Americans. If you raise the price of the tariff, if you raise the cost of imported goods, whether they are solar panels or semiconductor chips or electric vehicles or any of the other items, if you put a tariff on them, it means everything coming in from abroad costs much more, which allows the American competitors to charge more than they could have ever gotten away with if they had had to compete. We have a bizarre kind of capitalism in the United States. And by bizarre, I mean it puts our politicians in a very strange and awkward position. On the one hand, corporations want the government to do lots of expensive things for them. They want them to maintain a global military, to protect buying and selling around the world, which the United States does as much or more than any other country on earth. And it wants to protect its ability to get materials, to get them for a good price, and having hundreds and hundreds of military bases around the world, which is very expensive, not to mention the wars, which are even more expensive, is part of the cost of servicing what corporations want. At the same time, those corporations resent and fight against paying taxes, which would be the way the government gets the revenue to then do what the corporations want the government to do. All right, let's take a look then not at the corporations for a moment, but at the mass of working people. They too have things they want and need from the government to do. And like the corporations, the mass of people don't want to spend the taxes to pay for all of that. So we have corporations and working people, both of whom put demands on the government to do things which cost the government money, and yet at the same time, the corporations and the mass of people don't want to pay taxes. Last point, the corporations have enormous wealth to get the government to do what they want, and the mass of people do not. That is, nobody has so far organized the mass of people to put together the amount of money that might someday enable them to influence the government. But right now, and for most of the history of capitalism, the division of the income in a society between corporations and the people, and between rich and the mass of people, puts the overwhelming bulk of the wealth in the hands of corporations and the rich. And now what everybody knows who's honest, the corporations and the rich have been very successful in removing the burden of taxation off of themselves and onto the mass of people. This has been going on for the last century. And now here comes the point. After a certain level, the mass of people revolt. They say we will not pay more taxes. They make it impossible for politicians to keep doing what they've been doing, which is shifting the burden. For example, we used to rely on the income tax, which is a progressive tax. The higher your income, the higher the percentage you have to pay. Then, when corporations were strong enough, they got that changed. Half of what the government raises now is money off of Social Security, withholding from the weekly check of an American. That's not a progressive tax. That does not go up in percentage as you get richer. In fact, if you earn more than $160,000 a year, which rich people in this country do, you don't pay on what's above $160,000. Only the average people pay. So look at how successful corporations and the rich have been in shifting the taxes, but they can't anymore. The mass of people won't allow it. They vote out anybody who raises their taxes. Okay, now the politicians are in a jam. The corporations and the people demand services, but they can't squeeze more taxes out of the masses, and the corporations and the rich have basically bribed their way out of paying much in the way of taxes. So what is the government going to do? What do the politicians do? Answer: they borrow money. The way they keep spending on the corporations and on the people is not by taxing, but by borrowing the money. And that's why the borrowing is getting bigger and bigger, and all the national debt is the accumulation of annual deficits over the years. And they're going crazy now because the government, desperate to hold on to political power, is spending money like there's no going out of style. Wars, military expenditure, everything is being spent without the ability to make the beneficiaries of that spending pay for it in taxes, because it's impossible for the politicians to survive if they would dare do that. If you tax corporations and the rich, they will fund whoever runs against you in the next election. So you're gone. And for the mass of people, they are so stressed right now that if you tax them an inch more, you really will have a popular revolt. It's a sign that American capitalism is in a very bad place. We are not the great economy our political leaders would like us to believe, neither Republicans nor Democrats. We are in very serious trouble, and one measure of that is that this political absurdity of our politicians having to borrow more and more because they don't have the courage to tax means that we are in the situation you described. We are loaded up with debt in a way that we used to identify with countries that were in trouble economically around the world. Now we don't hear that so much because it applies to us in terms of the ratio of the debt to the national income. And make no mistake, the debt matters. People who are seeing this explosion are trying to calm the American people. Well, it's not so important. Most of the debt is a debt of the government, the Treasury, to the Federal Reserve, which is another part of the United States government. All of that is true, but it is not relevant. It's not relevant because in the end, the government has to raise the money to pay the interest on this enormous debt. And that means more and more of the money you and I pay in taxes is not going to give us a useful service. It's going to pay off whoever lent money to the government. And here's the last step. The fundamental injustice of the national debt is often overlooked. Who lends money to the United States government? The minute you understand this, you will see it's rich people and corporations, and to some extent, foreign corporations and foreign governments. The mass of people are not in a position, they don't have any extra money to lend to the government. So they don't. The mass of people pay the taxes that are used to pay the interest to corporations and the rich who are in a position to lend to the government. You will understand that when the politicians borrow money, they are doing an enormous service to corporations and the rich, because they're basically saying to them, we will not tax you. Instead, you shall take the money that we could have taken from you in taxes, and instead we will borrow it from you. And after a few years, we'll give it back to you. And during that time, we'll pay you interest on the money that we've borrowed from you. So for corporations, this is a no-brainer. Of course, it's better to have the government borrow from you than to tax you as corporations and the rich. And that's why the mass of people, even if they don't understand the economics, understand they're being ripped off. And the deficit is a mechanism for ripping off the mass of people who pay the cost of it, whereas the benefit goes to the corporations and the rich, who are the only ones to be able to lend to the government. One last point. Foreign governments are also able to lend money to the United States government. And most of the people watching this program probably don't know that the two largest lenders to the United States government are Japan and the People's Republic of China, ranking 1 and 2 among foreign lenders. China has somewhere around $800 billion lent to the United States government, which the United States government can and does use in part to fight a war in Ukraine where China is helping the Russians. If that sounds like a strange arrangement, welcome to modern capitalism. This might strike you as even stranger. With $800 billion of U.S. debt, the United States has to tax all of us, which it does, to raise the money, which it then sends to Beijing in interest on all the debt that the Chinese own of the United States government, which means that part of the money China uses to build up its military is the money we American taxpayers deliver to them. It's the way capitalism has organized the world, and it's not the least of the absurd contradictions that this system is living with and imposing on all of us. I must tell you, the number of people that I encounter as an American who are questioning capitalism, I've never seen that in my entire life. And the willingness of young people, particularly young people, to challenge and question what the government is doing, well, you can see it on the campuses around Israel and Gaza. They're questioning everything. And that's because they're not being offered the jobs they were taught to expect. They are not being offered the economic future they were taught to expect. And they are asking the questions that intelligent human beings have always asked when things don't work the way they're supposed to. And so I've asked myself, where is this going? And the answer I've come up with is the following. These young people are not going to be persuaded that voting for a Democrat versus a Republican, or for that matter, vice versa, that's not the solution. They understand the problems are deeper and that these people are fundamentally puppets of the way the system is laid out.